Speaking of Beauregard leaving, Beauregard leaving creates a vacuum, which means that now Halleck gets to come in. We're going to look at an artifact of that day, or of the preliminary to that day, and there is what we're looking at right here is not a very handsome document. It's a pencil-written document, probably written on the pommel of a horse or a field desk out in the field. 30th of May, 1862, headquarters. It is an order by General Halleck, signed H.W. Halleck, Major General, to Generals Pope and Buell. I do not wish Corinth occupied in force at present. General Pope will withdraw his forces and occupy the high ground to the south of that place. General Buell will have a cavalry force in Corinth and occupy the enemy's entrenchments with one division. Goes on to talk about what he wants McClernand to do, what he wants Sherman's to do. They're going to go to Russell. Somebody's going to go back to Russell's, and so on and so forth. But this is interesting because this is, sometimes I think we think of history as being an abstract thing. It's stories and books that we read about. They all come from actual events, and the events create artifacts, including paper artifacts. So I think everything about this order, as ugly as it is as a document, speaks to that day and that time. This was at Corinth on May 30th, 1862. None of us were. And so, Tim, tell us what you think about using primary sources. You having the letter in your hand, having the diaries.
To me, that's the funnest part. That is really where you get the essence of a campaign or a battle or a soldier or a general or whatever. You go back to those original sources. You can read about it in a book and get the author's take on it and all of that. But you go back to the original sources, and that's what's really so fun. And I tried to do that in this book. I tried to let the soldiers themselves tell the story in terms of what they're doing and get their flavor and their take on what was going on. So there's really a lot of manuscript research in there, and really that's the funnest part. It's kind of like a treasure hunt. You never know what you're going to find when you go into some archives. And I spent the day yesterday at the Chicago Historical Society in the Newberry working on manuscript research for a new book. And it's just amazing what you can turn up and the little small details that sometimes work their way into that. But you get the flavor of the people themselves rather than just this brigade went over here and this general did this and so on. I try to let the as Jeff talked about, kind of from the bottom up, tell the story. Of course, it's important to tell about the generals and the decisions and all of that, but let the soldiers tell their stories as well.
And you've already told us, Jeff, you did a lot of primary.
Oh, that's essential.
To find these characters.
Well, someone said to me, and I've mentioned this to audiences before, someone said to me in Virginia, "How dare you put words in the mouth of Robert E. Lee?" Well, okay, challenge accepted. If I dare to put words in the mouth of Lee or George Washington or Benjamin Franklin or Blackjack Pershing or Eisenhower or Churchill, I had better believe that those words are authentic to the character. Because if I don't believe it, neither will you, and the book simply won't work. And the only way to do that, I can't read a modern biography and find out who Robert E. Lee is, or Johnston, or Washington, or Franklin. I have to go back and hear those words, hear the voices. It's not a mystical thing. I don't hear voices. My father actually said that at one point, that he was visited by every character in The Killer Angels, and that makes him sound like he's psychotic. It's not a good thing to say to a newspaper reporter. But no, I understand what he meant. You have to hear the voices to be able, if you dare to speak for a character, to put words in his mouth, you'd better believe they're authentic, and you better get it right. First of all, people care. I'll hear from them. I'll get letters from people saying, this character never would have said that. I don't get that, which I'm very proud of, and that's because of the level of effort, the level of work that goes into this.
You did mention your father. Let's meet him. And there's Michael Shaara. From the dust jacket of The Killer Angels, winner of the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Mm-hmm. And this is another artifact of a place and time. And I'm going to let you tell most of the story, but I'll introduce it by saying this was not a book that was expected to make it. It did not have a large first printing, at a very small first printing. So the place and time that this evokes is 1974 in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, when we, back when we wish we had boxes of those first editions. It's very valuable. We're not going to talk about the monetary value of it, but it's a very valuable artifact on the market. But tell us about your father's experience with this book, how this became a national movement, or if you want to.
Well, first of all, Michael Shaara was not a historian, no background in history at all. What he was a storyteller. He had published a number of science fiction short stories, police drama. He was published in every major magazine of the day in the 1950s and 60s. He wrote a novel in the late 60s that nobody read. We went to Gettysburg as tourists, and he knew, as I said, he was a storyteller. Walking the ground at Gettysburg, he saw a story that he wanted to tell. He knew a good story when he saw one. And he started an odyssey that took him 7 years to write the book. He had a day job. He had to teach. He was teaching creative writing at Florida State to make a living, because he could never make a living from his writing. Maybe a lot of writers can relate to that. But The Killer Angels comes out in 1974 generally to a big yawn. If you think about 1974, end of the Vietnam War. Nobody in this country wants to read a book about generals. It was about as out of fashion as a book could be. And then yet, April of 1975, the telegram comes to my parents' house. Congratulations, The Killer Angels has been awarded the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Not for history, not for historical fiction, for all fiction. Now, any writer has the right to believe that when he wins a Pulitzer Prize, all the doors fly open, his ship has come in, his book will be a hit. I mean, anything he wants to do in publishing, they'll welcome it with open arms. None of that happened to my father. He went on, in fact, people often ask me, what other historical works did he write? None. He went on to write a baseball story, a Hitchcock sci-fi novel that nobody read. And after that, his health fell apart. And he died in 1988 from his second heart attack. He was only 59 years old. He was a 4-pack-a-day man. And at the time of his death in 88, nothing was happening with The Killer Angels. 5 years later, the movie Gettysburg comes out based on The Killer Angels. His book becomes a #1 bestseller. I sat at the premiere in Washington, D.C. in the National Theater with my mother sitting next to me when, what happens at the beginning of every movie when the lights go down and the credits come up on the screen, and saw, based on the novel by Michael Shaara that he didn't live to see. I've carried that moment with me throughout, ever since, through nearly the 20 years since, and it shocks me to think that in just 2 years, The Killer Angels will be 40 years old. I mean, yes, that's amazing. The paperback, the small mass market paperback, is in its 110th printing.
Ed Barst likes to tell a story. He's told it on this show of in the late 70s when it was available in paperback. But even back then, Ed was the great battlefield guide. Even when he was working for the Park Service, he was the great battlefield guide. Everyone wanted to hire him. And he tells a story about how he used to get on buses at Gettysburg. He'd look around the bus, and suddenly the buses had always been filled with middle-aged white guys. And he'd get onto a bus to do a tour of Gettysburg, and it would be half full of young women clutching paperback copies of The Killer Angels. Huge crushes on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Yep. Yeah, Joshua Chamberlain in Gettysburg today is a growth industry. Yeah. Between posters, T-shirts, hats. Yes, absolutely.
But it also, as Ed said, it brought women into an appreciation and into Civil War roundtables, Civil War tours. You started seeing them. Yep. It's no longer a boys' club when you're out there on the battlefield, and in that way, enormously beneficial to the national appreciation of Civil War history for everybody.
Yes,
it kind of opened up that.
It also inspired Ken Burns. And Ken credits that. I mean, there's a quote from Ken Burns right on the cover of the Killer Angels, and I know Ken, and he said it. I said it to me that if it were not for the Killer Angels, he never would have been inspired to tackle his own Civil War series. And if you think that series drew an enormous number of people to the subject matter in the early 1990s, and of course the film Gettysburg brought in that many more. All you have to do is ask the tourism people in Gettysburg. They'll tell you, they'll give you the numbers of how the numbers jumped exponentially every summer, the people coming to Gettysburg holding a copy of Killer Angels in their hand.
It reminds me also of Shelby Foote, who, much like your dad, really was not that well known in terms of Civil War history until the Ken Burns thing made him a star, basically.
That's right.
Absolutely. We have a few more minutes, but I want to make sure we give anybody who actually came to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop today a chance to ask questions. I'm going to ask the authors, since the microphone is here, to repeat the question that someone asks right here.
I have a question for each of you gentlemen. First of all, thanks so much for being with us today. Thanks to the bookshop for hosting this. For the Shiloh book, is there any ever pushback about people who object? Because I think Civil War geeks like myself don't read a lot of fiction. Is there any pushback to the idea of mixing fiction and historical fact in your book? And also, Tim, for Corinth, I visited Corinth about 20 years ago, and man, there wasn't anything to see there. Can you talk about what the Park Service has done to...
Sure.
Start with Jeff's.
Yeah, the question is do I get pushback of people, and I would call them purists, the people who really think that there's no place for fiction in the study of the Civil War. And I've met these people. I mean, I've met historians, real hardcore academics, and some of them are very famous. I could name names, and I won't. But there are some who are equally as famous who are very much in my corner, and I will mention names. Jim McPherson is one who said to me that, what you're doing is you're bringing an audience to my books. And a lot of the academics, Bill Piston, who wrote Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant, the biography of Longstreet, told me that very thing. If it wasn't for your father, he told me, he said, nobody would have paid any attention to my book. Now, because of Longstreet and how he's featured in the Killer Angels, people want to know more about the character. So the historians and the purists and the hardcore Civil War people who understand that it brings so many more, as we've just talked about, it brings so many more people to the audience for everybody's book. Everybody benefits. Well, the pushback my father had thick skin. My father would tell you, if you don't like my book, go write your own. I mean, that was Michael Shaara's personality. I'm not quite as thick-skinned as my father. I'm maybe a little more sensitive to criticism. But when I found out that the key here is when I found out teachers were using my books in their classroom and the Killer Angels to teach the history, I realized that adds an enormous responsibility to me to get it right. Don't fudge history. I mean, there are some critiques of the Killer Angels. The timeline has been kind of played with a little bit because in my father's day, there was nobody looking over his shoulder. There are lots of people looking over my shoulder. And I know that because I hear from them. I better get it right. So, I mean, the facts and figures are there because I have to, it's a tribute to the accuracy, historical accuracy, but still, as I say in the beginning of every book, and as my father said, to quote the Killer Angels, the interpretation of character is my own. And that's what makes it a novel.
Then the other question was for Tim. Tell us about Corinth in 2012.
Yeah, you had visited 20 years ago, and there was nothing there.
I felt like a wasted trip.
Yeah, and what's been done since? Well, the Park Service has moved in, and the Park Service, I think, has finally realized what other people are realizing, that you cannot separate Shiloh from Corinth. That Corinth is an extremely important part of the Shiloh story. So what the Park Service has done, they built on a local group there, the Siege and Battle of Corinth Commission, that started preserving land and going through the process. And since then, of course, it doesn't hurt that your senator was the Senate Majority Leader at the time and could get funding for it. But they built a brand new Civil War Interpretive Center there, which is first rate. It's huge place. It's very well done, and it tells not only the story of the war itself, and part of this, and we could probably get arguments on both sides from a group like this, in terms of the Park Service's new interpretation of the causes of the Civil War and all that, and it does some of that, but its intention, of course, is to interpret to the visitors Corinth, Shiloh, coming back to Corinth, the whole interaction between the two, the role that everything play there, and it is a unit of Shiloh National Military Park, so it's one and the same right there together, and they've preserved a whole lot of those earthworks down there, good earthworks that you can go see, and preserved a lot of the battlefield of Corinth, the October battlefield. Unfortunately, a lot of that, of course, after 140, 50 years has been taken up in terms of urbanization and so on. But what they have preserved, in the Civil War Trust, that I believe you're a board member of the trust, has done some good work down there as well. So a lot of different entities at work at Corinth, and it's really a good place. If you haven't been there in 20 years, you need to go back. It's a lot of good stuff down there now.
Yeah, it's well worth going back, and as Tim said, it gives, for all of the stories that Shiloh National Military Park cannot tell because it is focused on the Battle of Shiloh, Corinth can tell those stories. Corinth can tell the stories of the wounded coming back, and it can tell the stories of the contraband camp, and it can tell the stories. You have those opportunities, those resources are there.
And as we mentioned in one of the earlier questions, that is another one of those things that led me to go back and pick this story back up, because there's a wealth of knowledge that has come out since the establishment of the Corinth Center and the focus put on Corinth and the operations there, that was not there even in 97 when Peter Cousins wrote his book. There's a whole lot more material and wealth, and people just walking into the center today saying, hey, here's a copy of my grandfather's letters that were from Corinth. There's a lot more material, so that's another reason that led me to go back and continue work on this.
Yeah, Shiloh National Military Park, founded in 1895, one of the first 5 national military parks. Corinth Civil War Interpretive Center, founded in 2004. Just about 100 years later, it's one of the oldest battlefield parks, one of the newest battlefield parks, and it's definitely go. That's